The topic of condos versus co-ops in New York City real estate is one of the most debated topics in the city. Both condos and co-ops have different considerations when it comes to the initial purchase, lifestyle when you're in the property, as well as the various costs associated with buying and selling. In this video, we will be talking about the specific differences between a condo and a co-op, both when you're purchasing, when you're living in the unit, and when you're selling. This is Nick from HouseIt. If you have any questions about today's video or if you have any ideas for topics, give us a shout. You can contact us via email, team@houseit.com. The spelling is down below in the description. Now back to the topic of condos versus co-ops. The most important consideration when you're thinking about what property type to buy in New York City really comes down to the cost. The main benefit of buying a co-op apartment is in the fact that the actual purchase price can be anywhere from 10 to 40% less expensive than what you would pay for a comparable condominium in New York City. Now, the reason for that is there are many more cooperative buildings in the city compared to condos. Therefore, the supply-demand dynamic dictates that the prices should be lower for co-op apartments. The other reason why co-ops are less expensive is due to the various rules and restrictions associated with owning a co-op apartment. Specifically, when you purchase a co-op, you must submit an application to the Board of Managers, and the cooperative board has the complete discretion as to whether or not to approve your purchase. It's this additional quirk in the purchase process that is not the same thing as you would have with a condominium, and it makes co-ops slightly less attractive to investors as well as people who don't necessarily want to go through such an exercise when buying an apartment. So the buyer base for co-ops is also smaller. You don't have investors. You really only have people who intend on living in New York City for the foreseeable future. Another reason why co-ops are less expensive is because they have various rules and additional costs associated with subletting. More specifically, the co-op has the authority to vet and approve or deny any prospective tenant for your co-op apartment. What this means is that it's not necessarily going to be automatically approved if you submit an application for somebody to rent your apartment. Furthermore, co-ops also have outright restrictions on how often you can sublet your apartment. The most common co-op sublet policy in New York City permits subletting for 2 out of every 5 years, usually with a requirement that you initially occupy the unit for at least 2 or 3 years. Co-ops do exist that permit unlimited subletting, and investors do consider purchasing those types of units, but they are far less common, and it is much riskier as an investor to purchase a co-op compared to a standard condominium. Now, you may be thinking, so if I buy a condo, I have to pay more money. What's the benefit? Well, the benefits are numerous. Number one, the condominium board, while they will require that you submit an application in most cases, they cannot reject your offer to purchase the apartment unless the condo corporation itself actually purchases the unit instead of you at the same price. A condo generally also has little or no restrictions on renting. The condo board cannot reject your applicant for the rental, and generally speaking, condominiums have slightly lower fees and fewer restrictions surrounding renting as a whole. While a condo may indeed have restrictions on renting, they're usually fairly minor, and most of the restrictions in condominiums in New York City are pertaining to very short-term sublets type of activity, as you'd expect with an Airbnb type of operation. Most condo buildings do prohibit short-term sublets. Anything less than 30 days is usually prohibited, and in some cases, for larger condo buildings, there may be outright restrictions on the lease term, they will not permit anything shorter than 1 year. So the takeaway is that a co-op is a much less flexible form of ownership, but it's a less expensive property. If your budget is $800K and you need a 2-bedroom, it's more likely going to be a co-op. The other benefit of buying a co-op as opposed to a condo is that there are lower buyer closing costs associated with the purchase of a co-op. And the reason for this is due to the inherent ownership structure of a co-op versus a condo. When you purchase a condominium apartment, the form of ownership is akin to what you would have if you purchased a home or freestanding property. More specifically, you have a deed that entitles you as a fee simple owner with the right to use, occupy the property that you've purchased. With a cooperative, you're actually going to purchase shares in a private corporation that owns the building itself, and you're also given what's called a proprietary lease, which gives you the authority to occupy a specific unit in the co-op indefinitely as part of the ownership. Now, with a co-op, it's not considered to be real property for the reasons we've discussed, and therefore, if you're financing your purchase, one of the largest buyer closing costs in New York City, which is the mortgage recording tax, will not apply to the purchase of a co-op. So that will save you a considerable amount of money on the purchase, and it's one of the other benefits of buying a co-op versus a condo. Buyer closing costs for a co-op in New York City are closer to 2%, whereas if you're buying the exact same apartment, the same price, everything else, and it's a condo, and you're financing, your buyer closing costs will be closer to 4%. And there are many ways for you to reduce the cost of buying and selling in the city. If you're buying, you can request a buyer closing credit, whereby you are paired with a buyer's agent who agrees to credit you back some of the commission paid to them by the seller. Houseit buyer closing credit, feel free to check that out on the Houseit website. The other consideration with buying a co-op is one of the initial purchase process. We did mention that there is a board application during which the co-op will vet you, your financials, your references, and make a decision as to whether or not they would like to approve you as a new owner in their community. With regard to these requirements, many co-ops do have minimum financial requirements for buyers, which can be quite onerous and do restrict the size of the buyer base for some apartments. If you're looking to buy a co-op, you'll generally need to have a debt-to-income ratio of 25% or less. The minimum down payment for a co-op in New York City is usually at least 20%, and there are rarely such requirements for condominiums. The third consideration is regarding post-closing liquidity. Most co-op buildings will require that you have 1 to 2 years of mortgage and maintenance in liquid assets after you close. If your monthly mortgage payment and co-op maintenance payment combined is $6,000 and the building requires 1 year of post-closing liquidity, you need to have $72,000 in liquid assets to your name after closing. Now that is after you've paid the down payment and after you've considered your buyer closing costs. There is no such requirement with a condominium, and most lenders really only require you to have up to 6 months in post-closing liquidity. And furthermore, lenders are much more flexible as to what they define to be liquid assets. They may give you some sort of consideration for 401k. They may give you some sort of weighting that's helpful in coming up with that 6 months. Whereas with a co-op, it's at the board's discretion what counts, and many co-ops do not permit the inclusion of 401k assets as part of the post-closing liquidity calculation. So the takeaway as a buyer in the city is that if you're looking for a co-op, it's going to cost you less money. Your buyer closing costs are going to be lower, but your financials may need to be much stronger than what you'd need them to be if you were looking to buy a condominium, and that's due to the buyer financial requirements such as the minimum down payment of 20%, debt to income ratio around 25%, which is much lower than what lenders will target, which is around 40%, as well as the post-closing liquidity requirement. The final consideration when buying a co-op and comparing it to a condo is one of your seller closing costs. Generally speaking, co-ops will have slightly higher seller closing costs, and the reason for this comes down to the buildings themselves having additional closing costs, which are called flip taxes. A typical co-op in the city may have a flip tax of 2-3%, or they could have a per share amount, which would be calculated by multiplying the number of shares assigned to a co-op by the per share amount. So the takeaway is that, again, a co-op will cost you less money, your buyer closing costs will be lower, but you won't be able to rent it when you want. The building could reject your application. The building could make it harder for you to sell your apartment in the future, and when you sell, your closing costs will be higher. So if you have no constraints in your life, buying a condo is going to be your best option. It is real property. You can rent it out. You can hold on to it. There are fewer restrictions associated with your ownership of the property. We hope this was helpful. Please do subscribe to the Houseit YouTube channel. We promise to post new content regularly. Leave us a comment if you have any questions. If you had an experience buying or selling a property in the city, we'd love to hear about it. And please do feel free to contact us with any further questions.